and welcome. My name is Joe Garvin. I'm the author events buyer at University Bookstore, and I wanted to thank all of you so much for coming out tonight for our event with Robbie Robertson, who will be in conversation with Seattle's own Steve Scher. Just one brief note. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. One brief note about tonight's program. There won't be a signing afterwards. So there'll be a conversation and then a brief question and answer segment after which if you could just pause and hold and just sit tight for 1 minute or so at the end of the program so we can reset up here and then exit just out the same way that you came in. As I said, tonight's guest, Robbie Robertson, who will be in conversation with Steve Scher. Robbie needs no introduction. You know him and you love his work. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Robbie Robertson and Steve Scher.
Look at this. I'm feeling spiritually inclined here. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for doing this. And thank you for the music all those years. Much appreciated. Not your first book. You wrote a couple of children's books. With your son, right?
Yeah, I co-wrote this book, Legends, Icons, and Rebels, Music That Changed the World, which was a nice warm-up. And then I wrote a book for young readers called Hiawatha and the Peacemaker, which was inspired by when I was 9 years old in the Six Nation Indian Reserve, where my mom was born and raised. This elder told this story, and it just washed over me. It had such an impact on me. It was the story for sure, but the sound of his voice, and he even in telling the story, some of it he spoke in native tongue, and it was one of those things that just gave me chills. And after he had told this story, I said to my mom, I said, when I grow up, I hope I can be a storyteller like that. And she said, oh, I'm sure you will.
She was right. She was right. You even, isn't that how you dedicated the book? Isn't that how you began this book? So these are my stories. This is my voice, my song, and this is what I remember. What was that Six Nations area like? To go visit, to grow up there a little bit, but also to go visit. What was that like when you were little?
I felt privileged to be able to go, because I grew up in Toronto, and then to be able to go to Six Nations, where all my mom's relatives were and everything, to go between these two worlds felt like a special privilege to me. And because I was so young, I didn't know, nobody had told me yet that there was something unfortunate about on the reserve. It looked to me like they had it made. They could do stuff that nobody in the city could do. My cousins, which I've said this before, when we go out and play, they didn't climb a tree, they ran up a tree. They could do things. I had cousins that could we'd be walking along and they would leap up and snap off a branch and make an incredible weapon. This is boys' stuff, but they'd make an incredible weapon within a few seconds. I was like, that's where it's at. And also, it seemed to me that everybody, all my relatives, it seemed to me that they all played an instrument or sang or danced or did something, and it was like a club. And at a very young age, I thought, how do I get into this club? You know, I mean, this looks magical to me. And I had never been in a situation before where somebody was playing music sitting right there. And I could hear their fingers on the strings, and I could hear them breathing when they were singing. And so one of my uncles would be playing like an Iroquois water drum, and somebody else would be playing a mandolin with a couple of strings missing, and sometimes a homemade fiddle. And all of this thing, it added up to me, and I wanted to be part of this. And pretty soon, when my hands were starting to get big enough, they would show me a little chord here or there on the guitar, and it was like, it was a piece of magic to be able to play something, and it sounded kind of good. So this started, and between the music and the storytelling, and then after doing this for a few years, when I was about 12 years old, on the reservation, I started to think, I'm getting as good at this as any of these people are. Maybe there's something happening here. And from that push, from that inspiration, it pushed me, it did push me forward.
You like the city too, though. You described Toronto as this amazing place to be a little kid and grow up in, up until you were 8, right? The streets of Toronto?
Well, there's something to that side of life too, to figure out how the game is played, city life, what works, what doesn't, streetwise, all of that stuff. You know, at a young age, it started to creep in, and you think, oh, you have to figure this out. You know, you can't just let it come at you. You got to be able to figure out when to get out of the way.
You know, so you're starting to be in this club. When did you get your first full-sized guitar, and who gave it to you?
I got my first electric guitar.
Wow.
That was full-size to me, because I don't know. For it to get completely real, I had to go electric, which was a theme that stayed with me probably for the rest of my life. But I think when I was 13, I got my first electric guitar, and within weeks, I was in a band, and I was on this path. I didn't know where it was leading, but I knew that this was a calling, and I had to go there.
Yeah, you were in a band, you're 13, you're already getting gigs, right? You're getting gigs first few years.
Kinda, yeah, I mean gigs.
High
you know,
school.
it's like somebody, you know, so yeah. We were playing, but I was going with, I would be in one group, and, and I would try to take that to the next level, and then I had my own group. And then pretty soon it was like a stepping ladder, and I just had to just follow this, this journey that seemed to be laid out in front of me, and I didn't know how not to.
What do you mean you had to take it to the next level? What were you thinking?
I just wanted to get in the next better band. So I was in this group, the first one, there's a picture in this book here, the rhythm chords, that's when I was 13. Then I had a band called Robbie and the Robots, yikes. And then other groups, Thumper and the Trombones, and then Little Caesar and the Consoles, and I just kept going and going. And then finally, I was in a group, and we opened for this rock and roll band from the South called Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. And when I saw them, I had never seen this kind of energy in music. I had never seen this kind of crazy violence, beautiful attitude towards playing rock and roll. And Ronnie Hawkins was an amazing performer, and he would come leaping out of the air and land down behind the piano player and wind him up like an organ grinder, you know, and come in singing just in time. And then when I looked over and I saw the drummer in Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, it was like a white tornado. It was just sticks were flying and twirling, and he was standing up and playing and singing, and it was like, whoa, what's in the water down south that they can make something like that?
You opened for Hawkins, and then, 15, right? And he says, yeah, you opened for, that's pretty good in and of itself. And then he says, you want to do a little more with us, right? He invites you to maybe try out. You're 15, you're on a bus heading south.
Well, when I was 15, I heard him say that he needed to get some songs for his next record. So I went off and I wrote a couple of songs, and I brought them to him, and he said, well, I'll be damned. I'm going to record both of those songs. And I thought, okay, now there's a light shining through here. I thought that was the beginning, and he said, I got my eye on you, kid. I think you might have potential. And so a year later, when I was 16, he invited me to come from Canada down to Arkansas to try out to be in this group. I was 16 years old. I was too young. You had to be 21 to play in any of the clubs that they played. I was inexperienced, obviously, being 16, but I was trying hard. And the biggest downside was this was a Southern band. I was from Canada. You know what I mean? It's like in the South, you don't have a rockabilly band with a Canadian in it. It's just, you just don't do that. So I had a big hill to climb in this. And when I went down there, I thought, I'm not going to go back without winning this. And I worked harder. I practiced till my fingers were bleeding. Levon took me under his wing, and he showed me, he brought me into that southern, he's from the Mississippi Delta. This is the real deal. And he was teaching me stuff and showing me things musically, and I was making leaps and bounds because I needed to make this work.
Yeah, but you're still a kid. You had to ask your mom if that was okay, right?
See, when I told my mother, I'm going down to the Mississippi Delta to join a rock and roll band, she said, what? What? No, you're not. Nobody does that. Nobody goes to the Mississippi Delta and joins a rock and roll band. You're not doing that. And I had to sell her on, if I don't do this, I could be sorry for the rest of my life. And if I go down there and it doesn't work, I will come back and I will go right back to school. And she said, it's a deal.
What'd you do for Hawkins that said, all right, you gave him the songs. What were those first two songs that you wrote for him?
It was one was called Someone Like You.
How's that go?
Oh, God, it's too long ago. I was
Too
15
long.
years old. Jeez. Someone Like You. But somebody else, Adele, there's somebody like that has a song that they just recorded called Someone Like You. I should sue.
So what'd you do for Hawkins? What did you show him? You write about it. What'd you show him?
I showed him that I had more fire coming out of my fingers than anything he'd ever seen before. He could see, and he was all the time saying, son, you're too young, you're too experienced, you just, I don't know how we're gonna make this work. And you're from Canada, all of this stuff. It was such an uphill climb. but I couldn't imagine anything other than doing something to really impress him and to really impress Levon. Levon was kind of his musical ears in a way, and I knew that I had to go through Levon to get to him. And boy, oh boy, I worked on it until they just couldn't send me home.
Were you already collecting records by this point? Were you collecting a lot of records?
Well, when I went down there, when we went down to Helena, Arkansas, in the Mississippi Delta, just across the river there is Memphis, and I went to a record store called Home of the Blues, and I spent my whole first week's paycheck on records, and that was my musical education. I bought such incredible stuff you could never get up north either. And I listened to those records. I listened to those records in my sleep. I did. Without joking, I slept with a guitar.
Artists like who? Who were you listening to? Who were you getting? Who were the records you were buying? Because you write about it, you're listening for the unusual stuff too.
It wasn't unusual stuff. It was really just in this area down there between Clarksdale, Mississippi, Memphis, Helena. There's about 100-mile radius that I don't know what's in the water down there, but Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Elvis Presley, on and on and on. They all come from this area. And to me, it was the holy land of rock and roll. It was something so amazing. And I was there on a spiritual journey to gather, to absorb, to take this in, and to do something with it that nobody else was doing at the time.
Yeah, I think I heard you also wrote that you would, late at night in the far Canadian North, you'd get those 1,000-watt stations coming at you.
Yeah, I did. In the book, I said on these clear, cold nights up in Canada, sometimes these 50,000-watt stations, WLAC out of Nashville, you could get it down at the end of the dial, and you would hear these gospel shows and these blues shows and things, and the sound of that, I could hear where so much other music that was becoming popular originated. You could hear the source of that. You could hear the soul of that. And that was incredibly valuable to me. And it was part of the draw that made me think sometime I got to go to the fountainhead. I got to go where this stuff grows out of the ground.
Did you know what you wanted to do? You said you wanted to do something different, something new, but you had that guitar, you had an electric guitar. Did you know what you wanted to do, what kind of sound you were looking for? You could take a drink.
No, it was a discovery process, and every day was a new day and a new awareness, and something else would spark a thing. But I was just taking it in. It was boiling over inside of me. So at 16 years old, it would be foolish for me to say I knew what was around the next corner or what I wanted to do. It was every day I was learning.
This is the Zelig of music books. I mean, you heard everybody. You guys ended up going to concerts, hearing people who were playing, and it seemed like every artist in every genre, jazz players, horn players, harmonica players, were giving you something to do that you wanted to put into the guitar. Is that right?
That's my job. To take it in. And it not only became an early experience job for me, but with Ronnie Hawkins, after I got into the club, Levon and I, all of the guys that were from Arkansas, they started leaving and going back home. And we started picking new guys. And we found Rick Danko to play bass. And he could sing like a bird. And then we found Richard Manuel to take over on piano. It was incredible. And when he sang, he was like a 17-year-old Bobby Blue Bland, a white guy. It was like, we never heard anything like that before. And then the capper was Garth Hudson on keyboards. Nowhere on this planet is there ever been a musician that had whatever it is that Garth brought to this group. And then with that, with these people in the fold, we outgrew Ronnie Hawkins' music. And we were looking to make some kind of a noise out in this world that would change things. And we were all, as like I was saying, I started out gathering, then we were all gathering and gathering and gathering and pulling musicalities, playing the Chitlin circuit down south, playing everywhere we played. We would hear a gospel choir over here. We would hear somebody that had a tremolo on his guitar. You'd never heard anything choke up like that before. We would hear these rhythms, all of these things that we just gathered and gathered and gathered. And we were pulling it in to an arsenal. And like I said, we really felt this was our calling. This was our job to absorb all of this.
You write that around this time, there was a change in music. I can't remember how you put it, the artist that you said. On one night, we were listening to, I forget who you said, Bobby V, maybe it was. And the next day, you were listening to rock and roll. Like there was you noted the change. That might have been a little earlier than what you're talking about. You noted the change. What happened? What happened, do you think, with music and the culture that it went like that?
Well, yeah, just going back to this period, when I was 13 years old.
So this is 54, 56?
When I was 13?
Yeah.
When I was 13, yeah, it was like, so there, on the radio, there was, people like Perry Como and Patti Page singing, and really nice music. It was all fine. And then something exploded. Something came ripping out of the radio, and it seemed to me like that. All of a sudden, there's Little Richard. There's Chuck Berry. There's Elvis Presley. There's Gene Vincent. What happened? Where were these people? Where was Fats Domino yesterday? It seemed to me that they must have been just waiting behind the curtain, and someone said, now, and they came flying out. Of course, that wasn't the case. This had been stirring up for years. But in the South, it hadn't overtaken North America. It hadn't overtaken the world yet. But it went bam, like that. And I thought it was like the Big Bang of music. So I'm 13 years old. I'm already there with a guitar strapped on me. I've just reached puberty, and rock and roll comes along. It's a setup.
You met Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly gave you musical advice. What were you, 14 then?
I was. I went to one of those Alan Freed rock and roll shows, and it was so great. The music was so incredible. Bo Diddley was on the show, Chuck Berry, Fats. It was just mind-blowing. And Buddy Holly and the Crickets. And after the show, the audience all left, and I sat there kind of dumbfounded by this musical experience I just had. And everybody left, nobody threw me, and I saw the musicians, and they were kind of loading up their stuff, and the crickets were out there, you know, putting their equipment together. And then I saw Buddy Holly putting his guitar in his case. And I walked up to the railing there, as far as I could get up there, and I said, Mr. Holly, I gotta ask you, how in the world do you get that sound coming out of your amplifier? It's the most explosive thing I've ever heard. How does that happen? Is it just a Texas thing? What's going on? And because I was just a young kid and everything, he looked over and he said, "You play guitar?" I said, "I'm trying, sir." And he walked over and he said, I'm going to tell you what happened. He said, "See that amplifier there? It has 2 big speakers in it. I blew one of the speakers, and it sounded so good I left it." I said, "That's the trick."
I mean, you are immersed in the college of music from an early age. This is your passion. That's clear. Where did the songwriting fit in with the musicality, if you will? I mean, is it intertwined? Do you see the songwriting as separate? How do you see the songwriting and the gaining the skills, the chops to be a guitar player? Because those don't always flow. Those aren't always the same thing, the same person.
You know, it's a bit of a mystery how one person is drawn in that area and another person just doesn't feel that. From a very young age, even before I wrote the songs for Ronnie Hawkins, I thought I have to learn how to make this up. I can't just do what other people are doing. I've got to find out what I'm doing. And songwriting, to me, for many years early on, in playing with the Hawks and everything, nobody else in the group even thought about songwriting. It was like it didn't dawn on anybody. And I had been doing this, it seemed to me, since the beginning. So it just kind of fell on my lap. I didn't think of it like, hey, I'm the songwriter in the group. I just thought it's part of my responsibility, because things would come along and they would say, "Do you guys want to go in the studio and record?" We'd say, "Yeah, well, yeah, because you want to learn. You want to learn, you know, the skill of making a record." And so we're like, okay, we're going to go in the studio and record. What are we going to record? Nobody even seemed to dawn on it. So I would have to stay up that night and try to think of something and write something that we could go in and record. So it became kind of an automatic reflex, and it's gone on the rest of my life.
You still writing songs? I mean, are you
Yeah,
writing songs
of course,
regularly?
all the time.
All the time?
All the time.
Are they as influenced by the current trends in music as you were 40 years ago?
I was never influenced by the trends in music. When the band made their first album, Music from Big Pink, it was so not trendy. It was so not what was happening, and not because we didn't want to do something that was happening. It just wasn't our instinct. It didn't come natural to us to hear something on the radio by a popular group and think, let's do that. We were like, whoa, no. We came from another place altogether of we'd been woodshedding, we'd been paying our dues, we'd been gathering music. We had to do something that completely represented our experience towards music. And whatever was popular, God bless, but it had nothing to do with where we were coming from.
What would you call that? What would you call it? How did you discuss it to each other? Where we're getting Canadian, Southern, Acadian.
You don't talk like that. No, you don't talk like that. We never said to one another, "What are we getting Canadian over here? What are we getting?" We never talked like that. It was just the naturalness. It was what grew from our experience. Before we made music from Big Pink, we'd already been together 6 or 7 years, paying our dues, gathering, building something. And it came out in that music. And when that album, the first album came out, people actually said, which astonished me, "What the hell is this? Where did that come from?" And we're like, "What?" That's what happens. That's what happens when you woodshed and you gather and you learn your skill and you care about the songwriting and you want to do something authentic. You want to do something so true to your music. It has nothing to do with, the game of music. It has to do with the soul of music.
When you had to find your way in this life when you were a young man, and you were living this, I think it's fair to say, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle that you describe in this book. Who were the other people that you met? A lot of hustlers, you met a lot of drug dealers. What was their influence on you guys? Because it sounds like a lot of times you were hanging out with those fellows. Let's say they were traveling a darker path. What was their influence on you? The criminals, the drug dealers, the people that might be a little scary sometimes when you walk into a bar. What was their influence on you?
Well, in the early years, that's the world we traveled in. And a lot of our closest friends were expert thieves, second-story men, boosters, people that were really good at what they did. And I remember one night with a couple of these friends of ours, and we were sitting around just relaxing in the evening, and one of these guys, a professional thief, he said, "I hope you don't fall asleep because I'll be inclined to steal your shoes." And he wasn't joking. And it was just a world that we ran in these joints that we played. We played the funkiest, hardcore places. We played Jack Ruby's club in Fort Worth, Texas. We just knew him as Jack back then. And after we played this club, a few months later, we see him on television. We said, "Oh, look, there's Jack. Jack has just killed Oswald," And it's like, but it just shows this is the world that we were running in. And when I was very young too, I found out that my family was a different family. I found out my father wasn't my father. My mother told me my parents were splitting up, and my father, that I thought was my father, had become quite abusive and to my mother and to me. And then one day, she sits me down and says, "I should have probably told you this, but he's not your father." And it was like, I don't know, I was 12, 13 years old, and it was so staggering, I didn't even know what to do with that. But she said, I'm going to introduce you to the family of your blood father. And it was all like doors opening and things that you couldn't imagine stuff. My life was kind of like that. Just stuff was always swirling by. And I meet the family of my blood father, and they are so lovely. And they take me into their arms, and they treat me so beautifully. And my uncle, who was my father's younger brother, he especially takes me under his wing. And it's a very traditional Jewish family. He's in the fur business and the diamond business, and a little money lending too. It's just like very, very traditional. And I really like these people. And it's opening up a new world to me. And I'm so drawn to them. And then over the course of the next couple of years, my dear uncle, with his beautiful wife and little boy and little girl, he pulls off the biggest swindle in Canadian history. And he's telling me, I'm only doing what your father would have done. It's like, okay, all right.
What happened to him, by the way? Uncle Nady?
Uncle Nady.
Do you want to tell me what happened to him? You want to save it?
The what?
What happened to him?
What happened to him?
Yeah.
Well, he pulled off this swindle, and then in the midst of it, things got really rough. And the next thing, he became kind of the Mayor Lansky of Canada. And he was very involved with the underworld and the mob. And it became part of my life without thinking, do I like this? Do I not? It just is. It was a family thing. And it was an extraordinary experience and had very little to do with music.
The other family thing was when you first met them and you talked to them, you talked about your ability to remember things. And what they say, that was what the family had.
Well, my Uncle Nady told me, he said, your father had an amazing memory. He was a card counter. He was a professional gambler. And there wasn't a lot of talk back then in this period about card counters, and that he got that from their mother, who was a bootlegger and could never write down a phone number or an address or anything. She said, you got to use your head. You got to remember that stuff. So they convinced me that I had this gift of memory. And then also on my mother's side, she had an incredible memory too. So growing up, I don't know, I just had a great recall. And when I was very young, I was embarrassed by it because other kids couldn't remember nothing. I remembered everything. And I thought, am I just corny? They're cool. They don't have to remember everything, and I can't help it. I remember everything. And as it turned out, later on, when this was revealed to me, no, this is a gift. And in writing this book, boy, was it a gift.
Yeah, I read you had notebooks, but the notebooks you kept were scraps, sentences, poetry. So this book is full of detail, of story. That also means you're remembering not just the happy times, but the pain. So is it a gift? Does it still feel like a gift? A bittersweet gift, maybe?
Well, it is. It is bittersweet, and it's mixed blessings. And in writing something like this, it's hills and valleys, and you you go through periods and, and you remember that hurt and you remember what that put you through and you don't know whether you want to face it again. You don't want. So anyway, the process in writing something like this, it puts you through the ringer. But I felt after I wrote this book, and I wrote every word in this book. There was nobody telling me what to do or behind the curtain or anything. I found that this experience, I'd been carrying around these stories all my life, and they were heavy, and they were weighing me down. And finally, coming to the place of writing this book, I felt like I was setting those stories free, and there was a lightness that came with it. And with that, it made everything feel so worthwhile, having gone through that. And also, at the same time, there has been so much stuff written about this period, this era, about the band, about me, about Bob Dylan, about all of this stuff. And so much of it is crap. It's not true. It's people making up things that they think should have happened or maybe happened. I was there. I was in the room, and I felt an obligation to be able to talk about these things in a truthful, really honest way. And also that, there was a great gratification in that feeling as well. So at the end of the day, this may be the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life. And it may also be one of the most rewarding things, too.
You ended by talking about taking the high road. I think I want to get it right, because I liked that sentence, but of course, you say that. Bring on tomorrow. I wanted to get some on me. Let's turn the page. Let's take the high road. Let's break some rules like we did before the revolution. Were you guys the revolution? What was the revolution?
When we hooked up with Bob Dylan in 1965 and 1966, it was almost like a mistake. He was doing something, had nothing to do with the mission that we were on. These worlds came from so far apart. And when they collided, and we went out and played music together, he was leaving behind he was a hero of folk music. And he was leaving something behind and venturing into a new place. We toured all over North America, all over Australia, all over Europe, and people booed us and threw stuff at us every night around the world. In the midst of all of this, normally you would think, geez, the audience isn't really appreciating this. Let's make some changes. It never came up about making some changes. People told Bob, you got to get rid of these guys. They're ruining your career. They're ruining your music. He never budged. We played every night. Sometimes people charged the stage too, attacking. It was that extreme. In the midst of this tour, our sound man would record some of the shows. We would listen to these recordings and say, we could do this song, let's relax it a bit. It's a bit, a bit fast. It doesn't need to be that fast. Maybe this part over here, this introduction, we don't need to make it so, we would make adjustments. The audience couldn't care less about these adjustments. It didn't matter. One night, we're sitting in the hotel and we're listening to one of these shows. And I said to the other guys in the Hawks and to Bob, they're wrong. The world is wrong. This is really good, and I don't care. In your face, this is really good. And we went out and finished the rest of that tour and played harder, louder, and bolder than we had the whole time, knowing somewhere deep in our soul that what we were doing was real and was right. And that is a musical revolution.
Then you come back and you settle down and you find the house and you go into the basement at Big Pink. Was that the fire? What was the fire that kept you going after the touring with Dylan, after those impacts? And then you know, after the revolution comes the text, comes the treatise, right? You guys sat down and made these albums, that first album and the basement tapes. So was that the fire? Was that still propelling you, or was something else happening at that point?
It was a whole different episode. After this tour, after this whole thing and people booing us, right up to the very end of the tour, we get back to New York, and Bob says, "That was great, let's do another tour." I'm thinking, whoa, this guy, I'm telling you. Then he had an accident on his motorcycle, and he really kind of hurt himself. He was, you know, he was banged up for a while. And then we moved up to Woodstock, New York, because we couldn't find a place in the city to create, to make this sound, this noise that this group, the Hawks, that was becoming the band, needed to make. And we found this ugly pink house in West Saugerties, just outside of Woodstock. And I thought, this is it. This is the clubhouse. This is the workshop. This is where we're going to discover that noise that we need to make. And one day, I took Bob out there to show him our setup, and he said, whoa, we had the instruments in the basement. He said, can you record anything in here? I said, yeah, we got a little tape recorder. We got a little mixer and everything. And he said, I've got a couple of songs that are kicking around. Maybe we should try them here and see what happens. And out of that came the basement tapes, and out of that came music from Big Pink. So it was a good stop-off.
Do you talk to Dylan? Are you in contact with Dylan?
He's kind of a moving target. You know, he's always, he's on the road. He's always out there, and we passed some messages, and I'm really looking forward to us getting a chance to catch up and tell some stories. And I sent him the book, and to see if my memory matches his.
You guys can compare books.
What?
You can compare books if you want, right?
Yeah.
What do you think of him getting a Nobel Prize for literature?
It's about time, huh?
Well, he's the first songwriter to ever even be considered for something like that. Those words of his jolted you from the get-go. You write. You were always amazed at his language. Is that right? So that's what you say when it's about time? You heard it back then? I guess we all did in a sense, but they weren't getting the Nobel Prize back then for that.
Yeah, I didn't know where this was coming from with this guy. I didn't know, I didn't know you could put that much into a song. And when we first hooked up and became friends and were playing music, and I saw him writing songs. He writes songs, and lots of people recorded his songs. See him writing a song, he sits at a typewriter and types out ding, ding, and just sits there and writes these things. I've never seen that before. And then takes a piece of paper, picks up a guitar, and thinks of something that will go with what he just typed out. And I didn't even know that songwriters were allowed to do that. I'd always thought, well, don't you write, you get a musical idea and a melody and a something, and then, the lyricist comes in and finds something to go with that, or else you think of an idea that goes with that. He completely bent all the rules.
Do you still have contact with Garth Hudson?
Oh, yeah.
Still friends?
Yeah.
These are all these questions I have, and there's two left. I'll read the question. Do you miss Levon?
Oh, very much. So, Levon was the closest thing I've ever had to a brother. He was one of the greatest teachers I ever had in my life. And the experiences that I talk about so much in this book that we went through together, for better or for worse, he was an amazing guy, and I miss him dearly. And I got to see him before he passed away. I got to go and spend some time with him and sit and hold his hand and think about some of the incredibly amazing experiences that we had together. Nobody else has had anything like that. So I'm deeply indebted, and I think the world of him.
You can go down a rabbit hole, as you said, on the web of angry and ugly things. And he said his share in the popular press and in his book about you and about what happened. And you write about taking the high road. Was that enough? I mean, was that the grace? Was that grace that you were able to give and receive, going there and feeling that?
It didn't. It didn't get in the way of my respect and appreciation for him whatsoever. Levon got very ill, and he got ill in his body, and he got ill inside too, in a way, and it took him to a place. I never once said anything back to anything he said. He had done this with many, many other people, and then after the band hadn't been together for, 10 years or more, is when these things came out. And I thought, I felt sad for him that he had this kind of demon inside of him, making him feel so bitter and so angry. But I don't care. I loved him anyway.
Was Ronnie Hawkins right about getting more than Frank Sinatra when you got hired?
Well, I'm still working on that.
All right. Robbie Robertson, I'll let you go with that one. Read the book. You'll know what the answer is. Thank you.